All right, we are almost done layering our rough cutouts. And this last one I did is a nice kind of foreground element, gets us lots of color. But keep in mind the order of your layers as well. I want this underneath the cabbage blossom, so I need to move it underneath that cabbage blossom. There we go. And that might make me decide, okay, I like the cabbage blossom, but I don't want to have it take up so much space. Then I can always just select it and move it down or move it up. Maybe it's coming up because it is a fantasy landscape, right? So maybe it's coming up here, and maybe it's at a slight angle, so I can do Control T. So this is where it's not just rough cutting and sizing, it's also playing with the placement, even if it deviates from your sketch a little bit, for these different things that we find. And I can have it up like that and kind of overlapping with these different elements, because then I'll put it behind these grasses and flowers and kind of nest it in there, and that hides some of its flaws. Okay. I'm going to take the opacity down on this topmost layer. And now, even though I have the onion skinning showing, it's getting hard to see where my trees go. And if I need to, I can always refer to my original sketch in your sketchbook or wherever it might be. But they're kind of angled like this. I do like the decision not to just use mushroom boulders. That doesn't feel as jungle-y, right? This is starting to feel a lot more jungle-y, which I like. And I've got more sky than I thought I would have, but we'll see what happens with that. Okay, so now it's just these celery stalks as the trees. And this one's already cut out. It was a nice resource. I think putting it about there would work well. I'm not even going to resize it. And I'm going to nest it underneath that layer, so it feels like it's coming behind a canopy of things. And then when I do refined cutouts and things, I can reveal it a little bit as I cut out these leaves a little bit more cleanly. But I really like the red stalks of this Swiss chard. And I might even decide to drop down the guide. If I turn on my guides, at any time with the move tool, I can move my guides and decide, I want my vertical landscape to be a little bit taller. So I get a little bit more of that kind of foreground flower coming into it. Those foreground flowers. And the stalks and what have you. But also maybe not, because I don't want to rely too much on it. All right, what's next? This little piece that does need to be cut out. And this one that didn't need to be cut out still needs to be rasterized. Everything should be rasterized after you size it and place it. Going to use my lasso, just going to roughly cut it. Even though I have the guides on, they shouldn't derail that too much. Command J, but I'm on the wrong layer. So it said the desired area to copy is empty because I'm not selecting on the layer where there's pixels where I selected. So then Command J. And then click on the smart layer underneath and click delete. Then use the move tool, click on the right layer, and move it into place. And I might tilt it a little bit with Control T. And this one's also going to be nestled into these kind of flowers, but I'm going to leave it on top so that as I cut out the white, I will figure out how to kind of nest it into those plants. So they really feel integrated. And it will be on top of the cabbage blossom there. Okay, Now that's my most foreground layer. So I actually don't need to leave that lower in opacity, because now I've got kind of my Vegiescape jungle. And it looks pretty, especially if I put everything at 100%, which I'm now going to do. Bring everything up to full opacity. And I've got a lot more than 5 elements, so you're only required to have 5. But it can definitely help to have some of these transition elements, especially as things are like touching the ground, like at the edges of my lake, at the bottom of my trees. I don't even know what that one is. Oh, it's a little broccoli hill I have, but it's being completely covered right now. So it's kind of reminding us of these different resources that we've put in and placed. And I got a little out of hand, but I think it will be pretty. I've got a lot of things here. And I'll play with the opacity of the sky a little bit. That's kind of a pretty color for a sky. And then I need to bring in this background. But for now, just bring everything to 100%. And now, to save some memory, we don't need all of this working space anymore. But we do need some of it, because we might decide to grow. In fact, I'm thinking right now, I want a little bit more sky space. So I might take this ornamental cabbage layer, Control T it, or just move it up so that there's a little bit more space to play with. And I might move my guides to showcase that. I might give myself a little bit more width on this side. It looks like I've got placement for enough things to make that make sense. And then that might mean that my cabbage blossom can interfere a little bit less. That this can maybe shrink a little. And go at more of an angle. So I can see a little bit more of that mushroom lake. Even without the boulders. A mushroom soup lake. With that weird mushroom floating in the middle. Then it transitions into the chanterelles, and then that goes into the jungle, which goes into these hillsides that aren't that defined yet, but I'll get there. And then the beat, that gives me a little bit more room for this beat sun not to just be lost. But it is kind of nice to have the extreme foreground still overlapping the extreme background. All right, so these are the elements I have thus far, all just roughly cut and placed. So now I have a sense of what my finished composite layout will be. Maybe I make it a little bit wider as well on this side. And now I'm going to use my crop tool and save memory, quite a bit of memory, by closing it in. Not all the way, but around my image. All right. And now I'm just going to check something. You see how I've cropped off that little bit of broccoli there? I'm curious in Photopea if now that I've cropped and saved, if it will retain that pixel data when I enlarge the crop. Photoshop would not, but I think Photopea does it a little differently. So if I use the crop tool again and I extend it out and hit return, no, it doesn't. It does crop it off. So that's good. So that means it's truly saving our data. I think that the difference is as long as you save it after you crop, it will truly lose those pixels in the memory, which will help it all process a lot faster. Okay, at that point, I can turn off my guides. And now I am ready to start adjusting the colors and the lighting of each thing. And we do that with something called direct adjustments. And I'll do it from the background moving forward. So all these layers are here. They're all saved. I don't need my onion skin layer anymore. That serves no purpose. So I'm going to delete it, save that memory. Yeah, these all make sense, which is nice. Okay. And because these were all food photography, they're all lit very evenly. There aren't huge differences between them. They're pretty much all lit with an even temperature light, but I might want to build variation into them. And often when you're combining from landscape photos, some of them are more towards sunset, some of them are more towards sunrise, some of them are from noon. They'll have very different color temperatures to them. So it can be difficult to make things match. So we're going to start at the very base. And I'm going to start with my 100% sky. I'm going to get rid of any of these layers I don't need. I'm going to keep my sketch layer in there. But my sky, this is exactly as my reference was. This was the reference image. And it has all the qualities of it. It's rice paper, like watercolor on rice paper. Because it's rasterized, I can make direct changes to these pixels. And there's 3 direct adjustments we're going to learn and use a lot in this class. One we've used already for our cartoon jumble to make line art clean black and white. And so we go to Image, Adjustments, and then Levels. So this is the brightness, contrast, lighting adjustments. It's not going to change color. And we see the histogram. If we wanted to make it the most extreme we could bring these 2 outside sliders to the edges of the histogram. But that's not always what we want. I want this to be a little subtler. So the safest place to play with this histogram in levels is this mid-tone slider. Like either brighten it or darken it. I'm going to darken it a little bit. And then we have what are called limits. So if I want to limit how bright something can be, what the brightest bright can be, this basically can move the limit to, like, the brightest bright is going to be about 20% gray. And I can also limit the darkest shadow, that the darkest shadow in it can only be about 60% gray, if I wanted to gray out the sky. So I'll leave it about there for levels.
How did you get to levels?
So
again?
You go to Image and then Adjustments. So sometimes I'll call them image adjustments, but what I try to get myself to call them and get you to recognize them as, they're direct adjustments, because these are directly changing the pixels in the layer. What you do not want to do, at least for my class, is go to Layer and then New Adjustment Layers, even though the same options are there. Because adjustment layers are an attribute that's added to the layer. And instead of just affecting that layer, it will also affect everything underneath that layer, which can be really great for things like photo retouching. But for direct digital art, can just be really confusing. So I think of layer adjustments and adjustment layers we're not going to use. Those are attributes. Those are kind of indirect adjustments. So we want direct adjustments. So we go right to Image, right to Adjustments, right to the one we want. So we just started with levels. Now we're going to go to color balance. And I usually do them in this order. So levels is lights and darks. Color balance is color temperature. And you'll have the option of shadows, midtones, or highlights. I always start with midtones. And then you just play with the temperature of the lighting. Do you want it a little bit pinker or a little bit greener? And I'm just starting with the sky. What sky do I think would look more interesting?